Let me take you to July 21st, 1456, the 18th day of a siege that had already broken the spirits of lesser men, and paint for you not a romantic vision of medieval warfare, but the brutal reality of what Belgrade actually looked like on this sweltering summer morning through the eyes of the Hungarian and Serbian soldiers standing on what remained of its walls, men who could smell their own deaths approaching with each passing hour. Belgrade sat at the confluence of two mighty rivers, the Danube and the Sava, perched on a limestone bluff that rose sharp and commanding above the water. And before the siege began, it had been a formidable fortress with a citadel crowning the highest point, surrounded by thick stone walls built by engineers who understood how to stop medieval armies, with the lower town stretching below, protected by wooden palisades reinforced with earth and running down to where fishing boats once docked peacefully in better times. That peaceful vision belonged to a world that had died 18 days ago. Now Belgrade looked like the end of the world itself, a vision of apocalypse rendered in stone and ash and blood. The lower town was gone, not damaged or wounded, but utterly erased from existence, with every building burned to its foundations, the wooden palisades shattered into charcoal and splinters, and smoke still coiling from ruins that had been set ablaze a week earlier, rising in lazy columns toward a sky that seemed to have forgotten what blue looked like. Where Christian defenders once stood watch, Ottoman entrenchments now scarred the earth. Artillery positions carved into the ground with the precision of engineers who knew their deadly craft, and Turkish banners snapped in the wind over conquered territory, their crescents mocking the crosses that had flown there less than 3 weeks before. The citadel walls, those thick stones that had protected the city for generations, that grandfathers had pointed to and told their grandchildren would stand forever, were broken in over a dozen places, massive breaches gaping like wounds where cannonballs weighing hundreds of pounds had hammered the same spots for days without stopping, each impact weakening the ancient mortar until entire sections simply gave up and tumbled down. Towers that once stood 3 stories high, providing commanding views of the approaches, were reduced to stumps of shattered masonry. And where walls still stood, they were spider-webbed with cracks, visibly unstable, one more bombardment away from complete collapse, the stones themselves seeming to groan under the weight of their own damage. The moat that encircled the fortress, designed by military architects to be the final barrier between attackers and defenders, was half filled with rubble, with collapsed sections of wall having tumbled into it and created rough causeways the Ottomans could march across without even getting their feet wet. And mixed with the stones were bodies, hundreds of them. Turkish soldiers in quilted armor and Christian defenders in whatever they'd worn when they died, all bloating in the July heat, flesh turning black and splitting. The stench carrying on every breeze like a physical presence that coated your throat and made breathing an act of will. Inside the citadel, the streets were choked with debris, shattered roof tiles crunching under every footstep, cannonball fragments half buried in the dirt, pieces of buildings that no longer existed scattered like the toys of angry giants, and defenders moved through this wreckage like ghosts, their faces blackened by powder smoke, their eyes hollow from weeks without real sleep, looking more like the walking dead than living soldiers. The constant thunder of Ottoman cannons had left many half-deaf, their eardrums damaged by the relentless concussive force, so men shouted to communicate even when standing 3 feet apart, and still couldn't hear each other over the permanent ringing that never stopped, a high-pitched whine that would stay with the survivors for the rest of their lives. Blood stained the cobblestones in every street, so much blood that rain would still be washing it away weeks later, and the wounded filled every building that still had a roof. Men with shattered limbs and gut wounds lying on whatever scraps of cloth could be found, their moans creating a constant background chorus of suffering. The dead were piled outside the chapel because there was no time to bury them properly and no space left to dig graves inside the fortress. And the priests who should have been giving last rites were too busy carrying water to the walls. And now, through the smoke and dust hanging in the air, like a gray curtain that blurred everything beyond 50 yards, the defenders saw something that froze the blood in their veins and sent ice through their guts despite the summer heat. Ottoman banners were rising on their own battlements, The green and gold standards of the Sultan's elite troops being planted on stone that Christian hands had defended for 18 days of hell, and this meant only one thing. The Janissaries, the elite slave soldiers of Sultan Mehmed II, the same troops who'd broken the supposedly impregnable walls of Constantinople just 3 years earlier, had breached the defenses and were inside, establishing footholds, bringing up more troops behind them, beginning the final conquest. Europe's last fortress on the Danube was falling, the gate to the heart of Christendom swinging open, and nothing stood between the Ottoman Empire and Vienna, except exhausted men and crumbling walls. But two old men standing in that shattered citadel, one a dying warlord who could barely stand without support, the other a fanatical friar who weighed less than 100 pounds and survived on bread and water, were about to do something that no military commander in his right mind would attempt. Something so audacious and desperate that it would be remembered 600 years later as either a miracle or the most improbable military victory in recorded history. To understand why two 70-year-old men were willing to die on Belgrade's walls, why they would stand and fight when every rational calculation said to flee, to negotiate, to seek mercy, you need to go back 3 years to the day the world changed forever, to May 29, 1453, when Constantinople fell and 1,000 years of history ended in fire and blood. For over a millennium, Constantinople had been unconquerable, a city so well defended that armies broke against it like waves against a cliff, and its triple walls were engineering marvels that inspired awe in every military mind that studied them. An outer wall 40 feet high, backed by a second wall 30 feet high, backed by an inner wall that rose another 40 feet, and between each wall ran a moat, and towers every 50 yards provided overlapping fields of fire that made approaching the walls suicide, even if you somehow crossed the water obstacles. Byzantine emperors had poured fortunes into those defenses, understanding that Constantinople wasn't just a city, but the last remnant of Rome, the final link to an empire that had once ruled the known world. And for over a millennium, those defenses had worked flawlessly. Every army that tried to take Constantinople broke against those walls, Persians and Arabs and Bulgars and Russians, even crusaders during the Fourth Crusade, and they'd only succeeded through treachery and betrayal, not through direct assault, because the walls themselves had never been breached by force, never fallen to siege weapons or infantry assault, standing impregnable year after year, century after century, until people began to believe they were protected by God himself and would stand until the end of time. Then Mehmed II brought something new to warfare, something that would fundamentally change how wars were fought for the next 500 years. Artillery, not small guns or occasional siege weapons, but industrial-scale bombardment with cannons so large they defied belief. The largest cannon, called Basilica, was a monster that required 60 oxen and 200 men to move, a bronze tube 27 feet long with a barrel so wide a man could climb inside it and stand upright. And when it fired, the explosion could be heard 10 miles away, windows shattering in villages that couldn't even see the fortress. And the stone balls it launched weighed over 1,000 pounds and traveled fast enough to pulverize masonry on impact, each shot literally disintegrating sections of wall that had stood for centuries. But Basilica wasn't alone in this mechanical apocalypse. Mehmed had brought dozens of bombards, smaller than Basilica, but still devastating, each one capable of hurling hundreds of pounds of stone through the air with enough force to shatter defensive walls. And Hungarian engineers who'd defected to Ottoman service operated them, along with German mercenaries and Italian renegades, the best artillery minds in the world, all working for the Sultan, all focused on solving the same problem: how to reduce walls that had stood for over 1,000 years to rubble in a matter of weeks. For 53 days, those guns hammered Constantinople's walls day and night in rotating shifts that never stopped, the bombardment continuing through darkness and daylight, through rain and clear weather, a relentless mechanical heartbeat that never paused, never faltered, methodically destroying what human hands had spent centuries building. The Byzantines tried everything their desperate minds could conceive. They hung leather hides from the walls to absorb impacts, hoping the flexible material would dissipate the kinetic energy better than rigid stone. and they built inner walls behind the breaches, racing to construct new defenses even as the old ones crumbled. They launched night raids to destroy the guns, sending their bravest men on suicide missions to spike the cannons or kill the crews, and sometimes they succeeded, temporarily silencing a gun or two. But there were always more, always fresh crews, always replacement weapons, and the bombardment continued without meaningful pause. Nothing worked because nothing could work against this new form of warfare. The walls that had stood for 11 centuries, that had seen empires rise and fall, that had witnessed the birth and death of kingdoms, were reduced to rubble in 8 weeks by machines that made medieval fortifications obsolete. When the final assault came on May 29th, after nearly 2 months of constant bombardment, Mehmed's Janissaries poured through multiple breaches simultaneously, flooding into the city through gaps that shouldn't have existed, overwhelming the exhausted defenders through sheer mass and the advantage of fresh troops against men who hadn't slept properly in weeks. Emperor Constantine V, last of the Roman emperors and heir to a title that stretched back to Augustus Caesar himself, a direct link to the ancient world, died fighting in the streets with no crown and no throne, just a sword in his hand and enemies on every side, choosing to die as a soldier rather than flee as kings sometimes do. His bodyguards found his corpse later, headless and trampled by thousands of feet during the chaotic street fighting, and they identified him only by his purple boots embroidered with golden eagles. The last remnant of Rome reduced to a pair of blood-stained shoes. The city burned for 3 days after the conquest, and when the fires finally died and the smoke cleared, Constantinople, the jewel of Christendom, the new Rome, the city that had stood for 1,000 years as a beacon of Christian civilization in the East, belonged to Islam, its churches converted to mosques, its libraries looted, its people enslaved or scattered as refugees across Europe, carrying with them tales of horror that would reshape European consciousness. Think carefully about what that meant for Europe, for the psychological landscape of an entire civilization. Your entire life, if you were a Christian in 1453, you'd been told that Constantinople was protected by God himself, that its walls were invincible, that as long as Constantinople stood, Christendom was safe from Eastern threats. And it wasn't just a city in people's minds, but a symbol, a promise, living proof that Christian civilization could endure against any threat, that faith and walls together could hold back the darkness. Then in less than 2 months, it was gone, erased, conquered, the impossible made real, and if Constantinople could fall, if those legendary walls could be reduced to rubble, what was safe anymore? Your city, your village, your family, nothing seemed secure in a world where the impossible had become reality. The psychological shockwave was absolutely devastating and rippled through Europe like an earthquake. Refugees flooded west with horror stories, tales of rape and massacre and enslavement that grew more terrible with each retelling. And popes called for crusades that never materialized because the great powers were too busy fighting each other to unite against an external threat. Kings made grand promises they never kept, swearing to liberate Constantinople while doing absolutely nothing. And merchants rerouted trade because the land route to the east now ran through Ottoman territory and the costs had changed. And Mehmed, just 21 years old when he took the Queen of Cities, proved something that terrified every ruler in Europe. With enough cannons and sufficient will to use them, any fortress could fall, any wall could be breached, which meant that the old certainties of defensive warfare had evaporated overnight and nowhere was truly safe anymore. Mehmed, hungry for more conquest and understanding that momentum in warfare is everything, turned his attention northwest toward Belgrade. And the city wasn't as grand as Constantinople, with no legendary 1,000-year history and no walls that inspired poets. But strategically, it was more important than any city in Eastern Europe, perhaps more important than Constantinople itself had been. Look at a map and you'll understand immediately. Belgrade sits exactly where the Danube and Sava rivers meet, at the confluence of 2 major waterways, and the Danube is the highway of Central Europe, a river that connects the Black Sea to the German states, flowing through the heart of the continent. Whoever controls the Danube controls trade, military movement, communication, everything that makes an empire function, and Belgrade was the lock on that door, the fortress that controlled access to the river system and everything beyond. Beyond Belgrade lay Hungary, and beyond Hungary lay Vienna, and beyond Vienna stretched the German principalities in Poland and Italy, the soft heart of Christendom, with wealthy cities and populations that had never faced serious Ottoman raids. And if Mehmed took Belgrade, the road to Western Europe lay wide open with no significant fortress between the Danube and the Alps to slow an Ottoman advance. In summer 1456, 3 years after Constantinople fell, Mehmed assembled an army that dwarfed anything Europe had seen in a generation. And estimates vary wildly because medieval chroniclers had a tendency to exaggerate numbers for dramatic effect. But even the most conservative sources, the ones written by skeptical scholars trying to debunk myths, agree on one thing. This Ottoman force was massive, somewhere between 60,000 and 100,000 men, possibly more if you counted all the camp followers and support personnel. The army included Sipahi cavalry in chainmail and steel helmets, professional horsemen who'd been training since childhood and formed the mobile strike force of Ottoman armies, and provincial infantry from across the empire. Men from Anatolia and the Balkans and Egypt and Syria, representing the vast reach of Ottoman power. Akinji raiders served as light cavalry who specialized in terror tactics, fast-moving horsemen who burned villages and took slaves and created chaos in advance of the main army. And of course the Janissaries, between 10 and 12,000 of the best-trained infantry in the world. Slave soldiers taken as boys from Christian families and raised in barracks where every day was devoted to martial training, men who knew no life except warfare and served the Sultan with absolute loyalty. And Mehmed brought the guns, the same artillery that had broken Constantinople's legendary walls, massive bombards and smaller field pieces, all hauled north by teams of oxen and engineers who understood the new science of artillery warfare better than anyone else in the world. The march north began in early June, and village after village emptied as refugees fled ahead of the Ottoman advance like animals before a forest fire. And they carried stories of what was coming, tales that grew more terrifying with each retelling. An army that stretched to the horizon, so vast you couldn't see its end. With cannons that could level mountains and soldiers who didn't fear death because they believed dying in holy war guaranteed paradise. By late June, all of Europe knew Mehmed was coming for Belgrade, knew that the next great siege was beginning, knew that the fortress on the Danube would soon face the same guns that broke Constantinople. And the terrifying reality was that nobody was sending help. Not a single army was marching to Belgrade's defense. Not one king was risking his soldiers to hold the line against Ottoman expansion. Hungary, the kingdom responsible for defending Belgrade and the entire southern frontier against Ottoman aggression, was collapsing from within like a building with rotten foundations, torn apart by political factions that cared more about power than survival. King Ladislaus I was 15 years old, a boy controlled by rival noble families who spent more energy fighting each other than preparing for the Ottoman threat. And the Hunyadi faction and the Ujulaki faction and the Garay family all maneuvered for power and influence over the teenage king, while the greatest threat Hungary had ever faced marched steadily toward their borders. The royal treasury was nearly empty, drained by decades of internal conflicts and corruption, and the constant cost of maintaining frontier fortresses, and the Hungarian army was scattered across the kingdom, spread thin defending 100 minor fortresses along the southern border, none with enough strength to matter in a major engagement, each one capable of holding off raids but incapable of standing against a determined Ottoman siege. Morale throughout the kingdom was shattered after 30 years of watching the southern borderlands turn into a nightmare, with Ottoman raiding parties crossing the frontier regularly, burning villages and taking slaves and destroying crops, then vanishing before Hungarian forces could respond, creating a constant state of terror that left entire regions depopulated and traumatized. The people who survived in the border regions lived in constant fear, never knowing when Turkish raiders would appear, and many had simply abandoned their homes and fled north to safer regions, leaving behind fields and villages that slowly returned to wilderness. Now the largest Ottoman army in history was marching north with artillery that could level any fortress in Hungary, and the kingdom's nobles were still arguing about who should control the teenage king, who should hold which offices, Who should have access to the dwindling royal revenues, arguing while the empire burned? The regents, the powerful nobles who officially advised the young king, but actually controlled him like a puppet, refused to let Ladislaus ride to Belgrade's defense, despite his pleas to lead his army personally, telling him it was too dangerous and they couldn't risk the king in battle, which was politically true but strategically disastrous because kings who led armies could inspire loyalty and unite factions, while boy kings kept safe in castles inspired nothing but contempt. Western Europe, France and England, and the German states and Italy, those wealthy kingdoms that talked endlessly about Christian unity and the need to defend civilization, sent prayers and nothing else. Lots of beautiful words and no soldiers, no money, no supplies, nothing of substance. The Pope called for a crusade with all the formal ceremony and theological authority that implied issuing proclamations and promises of spiritual rewards. But nobody came because crusading was expensive and difficult, and the age of enthusiastic crusades had died generations earlier. Put yourself in that situation for a moment. Really imagine it. Your greatest fortress just fell to an enemy who's now targeting you directly. Your king is a powerless teenager controlled by squabbling politicians who care more about influence than defense. Your allies have abandoned you with empty promises and meaningless prayers. And no help is coming from anywhere. Not from any direction, not from any source. So do you run and try to save yourself? Do you surrender and hope for mercy from an enemy not known for mercy? Do you try to negotiate and maybe save some lives? Or do you stand with whatever you have and fight even though the mathematics of warfare say you'll lose? Hungary had one man who chose to fight. One man who looked at the approaching apocalypse and decided that running was worse than dying. And his name was János Hunyadi, 70 years old and dying from disease, but refusing to die in bed while Hungary fell. János Hunyadi's origins were controversial and remained disputed even during his lifetime, a source of gossip and political ammunition that his enemies used against him constantly. Some claimed he was the bastard son of Emperor Sigismund, conceived during a campaign in Wallachia when the emperor took a local noblewoman as a lover, which would make Hunyadi's rise to power a story of royal blood overcoming illegitimate birth. Others said he was the son of a minor Wallachian nobleman who rose through pure merit and brutality and military genius, clawing his way up from nothing to become the most powerful man in Hungary after the king, and the historical records were deliberately vague because it suited powerful people to keep his origins mysterious and questionable. Hunyadi's questionable birth was a political weapon his enemies wielded against him his entire life, whispering that he was base-born and unworthy of his position, using his uncertain parentage to undermine his authority whenever convenient. What wasn't questionable, what nobody could dispute or deny, was his military record, which spoke louder than any genealogy. For 40 years, János Hunyadi had been the scourge of the Ottoman Empire, the one Christian commander they feared and respected in equal measure, the name that Ottoman mothers used to frighten disobedient children. He'd won a legendary victory defending Belgrade back in 1440, driving off an Ottoman siege when everyone expected the fortress to fall, and he'd crushed an Ottoman army at Niš in a battle so devastating that it disrupted Ottoman operations in the Balkans for years. He'd led deep raids into Ottoman territory throughout Serbia and Wallachia and Bulgaria, burning supply depots and slaughtering garrisons and making the Turks fear Christian counterattacks for the first time in decades. Proving that Ottoman armies weren't invincible and could be hurt badly if you were brave enough and skilled enough to strike first. He'd become the most feared Christian commander in Eastern Europe, the one man the Ottomans genuinely respected as a worthy opponent, and his reputation was such that his presence on a battlefield affected Ottoman morale, making their soldiers nervous and their commanders cautious. But now in summer 1456, Hunyadi was dying from some wasting illness that medieval medicine couldn't diagnose or treat, suffering from fever and chills and weakness that left him gaunt and gray, unable to eat properly, growing thinner by the week, and everyone who saw him knew with absolute certainty that he didn't have long to live, that his body was failing him even though his mind remained sharp. When word reached him that Mehmed was marching on Belgrade with the same army that broke Constantinople, With artillery that could reduce any fortress to rubble, János Hunyadi made his choice immediately without hesitation or debate. He would go to Belgrade and hold the fortress or die there. Those were the only two options he would consider, and dying in bed while hungry fell was not acceptable. But he knew the brutal truth that military experience teaches you if you survive long enough. He couldn't do it alone, couldn't hold a fortress against that army with just his personal retinue and whatever garrison was already there, because the mathematics of siege warfare were absolutely clear and numbers mattered tremendously. He needed an army, needed thousands of soldiers to man the walls and fight the assaults and repair the damage. And Hungary's paralyzed nobility wasn't giving him one, wasn't sending him reinforcements or supplies or anything useful. Then, as if in answer to a prayer he probably didn't believe in, because Hunyadi was more pragmatist than pious, as if providence or fate or blind chance had decided to intervene, God sent him a madman, a 4-foot-tall Franciscan friar who claimed to have visions and promised peasants they could defeat empires through faith alone. And his name was Giovanni da Capistrano, and he was about to raise an army that defied all military logic and common sense. Giovanni da Capistrano had never held a sword in his life, had no military training whatsoever, no experience with tactics or strategy or the brutal mathematics of warfare, but he was 70 years old, same age as Hunyadi, and where Hunyadi was a pragmatic warrior who understood warfare's brutal realities and knew that battles were won through steel and logistics and discipline, Capistrano was a fanatic who believed mathematics didn't matter when God was on your side, who thought faith could literally stop cannonballs and turn peasants into unstoppable warriors through sheer divine intervention. He was a Franciscan friar, maybe 4 feet tall if you were generous with the measurement, shriveled from decades of deliberate fasting and self-mortification that left him looking like a skeleton wrapped in brown robes, eating 1 meal a day of bread and water and sleeping on bare ground, even when offered actual beds, treating his body like an obstacle to spiritual purity that needed to be beaten into submission. Before becoming a monk, before dedicating his life to religious fanaticism, he'd been a lawyer and governor in Naples, a successful man by worldly standards with power and influence and a comfortable life, until a scandal landed him in prison, and there, according to his own account, the Virgin Mary appeared to him in a vision and told him to abandon worldly power for spiritual warfare, to leave behind material success and dedicate himself to fighting for God's kingdom instead of earthly ones. He'd spent the last 30 years doing exactly that with terrifying energy, traveling across Europe like a whirlwind, whipping crowds into religious frenzy wherever he went, preaching against heretics and Jews and anyone else he deemed insufficiently Christian. And now the Ottoman threat with apocalyptic fury that convinced thousands of peasants they were witnessing the end times. In spring 1456, Pope Calixtus III gave him a specific mission: raise a crusade to save Belgrade, gather an army of faithful Christians, and march them to the fortress that stood between Christendom and Ottoman conquest. And Capistrano saw this assignment as prophecy fulfilled, as the final battle he'd been waiting for his entire life, Armageddon on the Danube, where good and evil would clash in a struggle that would determine humanity's fate. He started in southern Germany, moving from village to village with a banner showing Christ crucified, and his method was calculated theater designed to manipulate emotions and create mass hysteria. He'd arrive in a town square at noon when people gathered for market. Without any advance warning, just this skeletal old man appearing suddenly with his banner, climbing onto a platform or cart, and beginning to preach. Not calm sermons about doctrine or theology, but explosions of emotional intensity that grabbed people by the throat. Witnesses who heard him, and many wrote accounts later, described the same pattern happening in town after town. He'd start quiet, almost conversational, talking about Christ's suffering on the cross in intimate detail that made people uncomfortable. Then his voice would rise gradually as he described the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople, the churches defiled and altars smashed and priests murdered and Christian children taken as slaves. And his voice would crack with emotion, real or performed but convincing either way, and he'd weep openly, tears streaming down his weathered face. and people watching would start weeping too, caught up in the collective emotion. Then he'd hold up his crucifix, this ornate cross he carried everywhere, and make the promise that changed everything. Any man who took up arms against the Turks and died fighting would bypass purgatory entirely, skipping centuries of suffering and going straight to heaven. No waiting, no judgment, immediate salvation the moment they died with a sword in their hands. For medieval peasants who believed they'd spend centuries suffering in purgatory for their sins, for people taught that every lie and theft and moment of lust would be punished with spiritual torment before they could enter paradise. This was revolutionary theology, radical and almost heretical in its simplicity. Die fighting Turks, wake up in paradise, all sins forgiven, all debts paid, instant access to eternal joy. And Capistrano didn't just preach about miracles in abstract theological terms. He performed them, or at least people believed he did, which amounted to the same thing in practice. In Nuremberg, according to witnesses, a woman brought her daughter who couldn't walk, legs twisted from some birth defect or childhood disease, and Capistrano placed his hands on the girl's legs and prayed in Latin while the crowd watched in silence, and people swore they saw the girl stand up and walk. Whether through miracle or mass hysteria or stage performance didn't matter because the belief was real. In Frankfurt, a man blind in one eye claimed he could see after Capistrano touched him and prayed over him, and whether this was real healing or psychosomatic improvement or simple fraud, the crowd believed, and belief was what Capistrano needed because belief created more belief, spreading through crowds like fire through dry grass. Real miracles or mass hysteria or stage performances, the distinction didn't matter to medieval peasants who desperately wanted to believe in divine intervention, who needed to believe that God still performed miracles in a world that seemed increasingly hostile and unfair. The people believed, and belief was exactly what Capistrano needed to turn frightened peasants into crusaders, willing to march towards certain death. Understand carefully who answered Capistrano's call, because this is crucial to understanding what happened at Belgrade. These weren't knights or trained soldiers or even young men in their physical prime. These were the powerless responding to the one message that made their suffering meaningful. Medieval society was a rigid pyramid where everyone knew their place, and movement between social classes was nearly impossible. At the top sat nobility who owned the land and made the laws. Below them, knights who fought for the nobility in exchange for land grants and privileges. Below them, free farmers who worked land they didn't own, but at least had some legal rights and could theoretically leave if they wanted to. And at the very bottom, serfs, essentially slaves bound to the land they worked, legally forbidden to leave without permission from their lord, trapped in generational poverty where your children and grandchildren would do exactly what you did until the end of time. Capistrano's crusade pulled from the bottom of that pyramid, from the people who had nothing to lose because they already had nothing. They were peasants who gave 60% or more of their harvest to lords and survived on the rest, barely scraping by in good years and starving in bad ones. Men who worked from dawn to dusk every single day with no hope their children's lives would be any better, trapped in cycles of poverty that seemed to have no escape. They were criminals sitting in local jails, thieves and brawlers and men who'd poached a deer from noble forests to feed their starving families, offered pardons if they took the cross and marched to fight Turks. Given a chance to erase their crimes through holy warfare, they were Serbian refugees who'd fled when the Ottomans conquered their homeland, now living as displaced outsiders in Hungarian towns, sleeping in barns and working for scraps, burning for revenge against the empire that destroyed everything they'd known, desperate for any chance to strike back. They were old men past their prime, too weak for hard farm labor, told by their families they were useless mouths to feed, burdens who consumed resources without producing anything valuable, desperate for one last chance to matter, to prove they still had value, to die for something instead of simply fading away into forgotten graves. For most of these people, life was suffering punctuated by more suffering, endless hard labor that broke your body by 40, hunger that never quite went away, even in good years, disease that killed your children before they reached 5 years old, brutality from nobles who viewed peasants as livestock that happened to speak. There was no escape from this cycle, No hope that anything would ever change. No reason to believe tomorrow would be better than today. Just grinding poverty from birth to death across generations. Then Capistrano showed up in their village square and told them they could be heroes instead of victims, warriors of God instead of oppressed laborers, that their poverty and suffering meant nothing because heaven awaited anyone brave enough to fight, that the noblemen who oppressed them would burn in hell for their cruelty, while they, the wretched of the earth, would sit at God's right hand if they died fighting Turks, that all the injustice and pain and degradation they'd endured would be answered with eternal glory if they just had the courage to march east and raise a sword. It was the most radical message they'd ever heard, more revolutionary than any political philosophy, more transformative than any economic reform, because it told them that their suffering had meaning, that they mattered to God even if they didn't matter to nobles, that they could achieve something greater than the grinding poverty waiting for them at home. And they believed, tens of thousands of them believed with absolute conviction and came by the thousands to join Capistrano's crusade. They marched with whatever tools they owned because they couldn't afford actual weapons: scythes for cutting wheat, pitchforks for moving hay, wood-cutting axes, butcher knives, anything that had a blade or a point, or could be swung with enough force to hurt someone. Some had actual weapons, old swords their grandfathers had used in forgotten wars, rusted spears that hadn't been maintained properly, hunting bows designed for deer, but theoretically capable of killing men if you were close enough and lucky enough. Most wore the clothes they'd been working in when they heard Capistrano preach: wool tunics worn thin from years of use, leather vests that might stop a knife if you were incredibly lucky, cloth wraps around their feet because actual boots were luxuries they couldn't afford. Almost none had real armor because armor was expensive and peasants were poor, though a few had leather jerkins or quilted jackets that might absorb some impact. And one man, according to chronicles, actually showed up wearing a cooking pot on his head as a helmet, which would have been comical except he was willing to die wearing it. But they had faith, absolute, unshakable conviction that God would protect them and guide their hands, that divine intervention would make up for their lack of training and equipment and experience, and that faith was more powerful than any rational assessment of their chances could undermine. Capistrano's crusade swelled as it moved east through Hungary like a river collecting tributaries, growing larger with every village it passed. Entire villages emptied as men left fields unharvested to join the march, abandoning crops that would rot in the fields because they believed the apocalypse was coming and harvest didn't matter anymore. Minor nobles joined with small retinues of professional soldiers, bringing some actual military experience and real weapons that might make a difference, seeking glory or redemption, or simply understanding that if Belgrade fell, their own lands would be next. Priests joined carrying relics they swore were authentic: saints' bones and fragments of the true cross, and holy banners, objects believed to contain divine power that would protect the faithful in battle. The columns stretched for miles when fully assembled, and dust clouds marked the crusade's passage across the summer countryside, visible from far away, and hymns echoed for miles, thousands of voices singing in rough harmony, creating an atmosphere more religious festival than military campaign. By the time Capistrano reached the Danube in late June, estimates put his army between 20 and 40,000 people, though many were camp followers rather than fighters. Wives who refused to be left behind, children too young to be useful but too dependent to abandon, servants and craftsmen and others who attached themselves to any large group. But even conservative counts, the ones written by skeptics trying to minimize the miracle aspect, put his actual fighting force at 25,000 men minimum, an army of faith led by a 4-foot-tall friar who'd never commanded troops in his life, marching to face the conqueror of Constantinople with farming tools and absolute conviction. When János Hunyadi saw Capistrano's crusader army approaching Belgrade, his heart must have sunk despite his poker face, because he'd spent 40 years as a professional soldier and understood what war actually was: not glory and miracles and divine intervention, but logistics and discipline, and knowing when to hold your ground and when to retreat and live to fight another day. He knew with absolute certainty what it took to beat the Ottomans in actual combat, had learned through decades of experience bought with blood and failure and hard-won victories. You needed trained soldiers who could hold formation under fire and wouldn't break when friends started dying. Cavalry that could execute coordinated charges instead of just riding forward in a disorganized mob. Archers who could hit targets at 200 yards consistently, and discipline, iron discipline, that kept men in their positions when every instinct screamed to run. What he got instead was a mob of religious zealots armed with farm tools and no training whatsoever. 25,000 people who'd never seen combat and had no idea what they were volunteering for, led by an elderly friar who thought prayer was more important than tactics. The two men met in early July as Hunyadi prepared Belgrade's defenses and surveyed the approaching Ottoman army through his brass telescope, and no detailed account of their first meeting survived in the historical record. But we know from letters written later by both men that they argued intensely almost immediately. Hunyadi wanted the crusaders kept away from the actual walls during combat, wanted to use them for labor instead, digging trenches and hauling supplies, and building earthworks and clearing rubble. Anything that would be useful but didn't involve putting untrained peasants against Ottoman Janissaries, because putting civilians with pitchforks against the best infantry in the world would be a massacre that accomplished nothing except wasting lives. Capistrano refused with all the moral certainty of a fanatic who believes God speaks through him, insisting that his people weren't laborers or servants, but warriors of God who'd come to fight. And when the Turks attacked in force, his crusaders would stand on the walls beside professional soldiers, and God would guide their hands and make them invincible through faith alone. And tactics and training didn't matter when divine providence was on your side, and suggesting his faithful followers should dig ditches instead of fighting was insulting to them and to God himself. The two men were opposites in every measurable way that mattered. Hunyadi was tall with aristocratic bearing, despite his questionable birth, carrying himself like the nobleman he'd become through achievement. A man who'd commanded armies for decades and bore the scars to prove it, both visible scars on his body and invisible ones in his mind from decisions that got good men killed. He spoke quietly and planned carefully and trusted experience over inspiration, believing that warfare followed certain rules, and ignoring those rules got people killed for no purpose. Capistrano was tiny, skeletal from self-imposed fasting, eating one meal a day of bread and water by choice, sleeping on bare ground even when offered actual beds because he believed physical comfort weakened spiritual strength. He spoke in absolutes with complete certainty about matters he'd never personally experienced, trusting God over tactics, believing that faith could literally alter physical reality if you believed hard enough, and that suggesting otherwise was heresy. But despite being opposites, despite disagreeing on almost everything related to how warfare worked, they shared one critical thing that mattered more than their differences. Neither would abandon Belgrade no matter what. Hunyadi wouldn't abandon it because he'd spent his life defending Hungary and wouldn't stop now even while dying, even when his body screamed for him to rest, even when every rational voice said the fortress couldn't hold. Capistrano wouldn't abandon it because he believed this was the prophesied battle, the moment he'd been preparing for his entire life, and fleeing would damn his soul eternally because it would mean admitting that faith wasn't enough, that God had abandoned his faithful followers. So they reached an uneasy agreement that satisfied neither man but allowed them to work together. Capistrano's crusaders would be allowed to enter the city and be present during the siege, but Hunyadi would command the actual defense, would make all military decisions about positioning and tactics and when to fight and when to pull back. When and if the time came for the crusaders to actually fight, if they were needed in combat, Hunyadi would decide where and how they'd be deployed. Capistrano agreed for now, though everyone who knew him suspected he'd ignore that agreement the moment he felt God calling him to action. Hunyadi arrived at the fortress on July 2nd with his own forces, 5,000 to 7,000 trained soldiers, who represented the core of Hungary's defensive capability, Hungarian cavalry, noble sons and professional horsemen in chainmail who'd trained since childhood, Serbian mercenaries who'd fought Turks for years and survived through skill and brutality, and his personal household guard, 50 men who'd followed him for decades through countless campaigns, veterans who'd seen everything warfare could throw at them and were still standing. The garrison already in Belgrade, commanded by Hunyadi's brother-in-law, Mihaly Silagi, numbered about 2,000 men, and Silagi had spent the past month preparing obsessively for what everyone knew was coming. Reinforcing the lower town's wooden palisades with extra timber and earth, stockpiling food in underground cellars and gunpowder in protected magazines, drilling the militia in basic defensive tactics, teaching men who'd never been in combat how to hold a spear and stand in formation, preparing mentally and physically for the siege that would determine whether Hungary survived as an independent kingdom. Then Capistrano arrived with his crusaders, and the city's population exploded overnight from about 7,000 to over 40,000 people. Tens of thousands poured through the gates in a continuous stream that lasted for days. Fighters and followers and families who refused to be separated, people who brought nothing but the clothes they wore and faith in divine protection. The fortress couldn't physically hold them all in any organized way, so people camped wherever they could find space, in courtyards and streets and the lower town, anywhere there was open ground. Spreading through the fortress like floodwater, filling every crack and crevice. Most of the crusaders couldn't fight worth anything against trained soldiers, had no real combat skills or useful weapons, but they had hands and backs and could work. They could carry stones for wall repairs, haul water from the rivers to put out fires and keep defenders hydrated, tend the wounded in makeshift hospitals, cook for the soldiers who'd actually be doing the fighting. And in a siege, that labor was absolutely essential, because fortresses don't fall just from combat. They fall when exhausted defenders can't repair damage, and wounded men die from lack of care, and supplies run out. And the crusaders prayed constantly with intensity that impressed even hardened soldiers. The entire city echoed day and night with hymns and chants and prayers in Latin that most didn't understand but repeated with conviction. Every church in Belgrade held services around the clock, priests conducting masses in shifts because the faithful wanted to pray constantly to maintain an unbroken channel to God, who they believed was watching and protecting them. Capistrano led prayers on street corners and in the citadel courtyard and anywhere people gathered, his voice somehow carrying above the noise, rallying the faithful with promises that God would deliver them from evil. To the professional soldiers, men like Hunyadi and Silagi, who understood warfare as craft not miracle, the constant religious fervor was somewhat maddening, endless noise that made concentration difficult. But to the common defenders, ordinary men who knew they were vastly outnumbered and facing the army that broke Constantinople, the prayers provided something concrete to hold on to besides fear and despair. July 4th, 1456, the day the Ottoman army arrived and the siege officially began. From the citadel walls, defenders watched the horizon darken in the early morning light, but not with storm clouds, with men, thousands and thousands of men stretching as far as eyes could see. The Ottoman army deployed across the plains south of Belgrade like a slow-moving flood of humanity and metal, methodical and professional, and terrifying in its sheer scale. The first elements appeared at dawn, Akansha scouts on light horses, ranging ahead in small groups to probe defenses and identify weak points and occasionally shoot arrows at sentries just to keep everyone nervous. Then came the vanguard, provincial infantry in ordered columns, marching with drums beating a steady rhythm, their formation perfect despite the heat, advancing with the discipline of professional soldiers who'd done this many times before. By midday, the main body arrived and the plains south of Belgrade transformed into a temporary city as tent after tent rose across the landscape. Command pavilions made of silk dyed in brilliant colors, barracks tents for infantry that stretched in organized rows, horse lines for the cavalry where thousands of animals were picketed and watered, supply dumps where wagons unloaded food and ammunition, field hospitals with surgeons and their terrible saws. An entire mobile city springing up within hours, organized with efficiency that spoke to years of campaign experience. The defenders counted banners from the walls, trying to estimate numbers and identify units, and every Ottoman province had distinct colors and symbols that told experienced observers where troops came from. Rumelia, the European territories; Anatolia, the Asian heartland; Karaman, Dulkadir, Egypt newly conquered. Each banner represented thousands of men, and the banners kept coming all afternoon. Then came the guns, and the artillery train took all afternoon to position properly, because moving those massive cannons was engineering challenge. Teams of oxen, 60 animals for the largest guns, hauled the massive bombards slowly across the plain, the weapons so large they moved on custom-built wagons reinforced with iron that could barely support their weight. Smaller falconets and serpentines came up on regular carts, still deadly but manageable with normal transport. Ottoman engineers, men trained in mathematics and geometry, surveyed the fortress carefully, calculating firing angles and measuring distances with instruments, determining where each gun should be positioned for maximum effect. Powder and shot were unloaded from supply wagons and stacked in protected magazines, built from earth and timber walls that would prevent chain reactions if anything exploded. Because gunpowder was valuable, and losing your ammunition supply to accident was how sieges failed. The largest bombard, defenders watching couldn't know its name, but could see its terrifying size, required 60 oxen to drag into position, and took 3 hours of careful work to set up properly. And when it was finally positioned, pointing at the lower town's palisades, the gunners built an earthen platform behind it to absorb the recoil that would otherwise flip the gun backward when it fired. On the hill overlooking the entire fortress, providing a commanding view of the battlefield, Mehmed's personal pavilion rose. Silk walls dyed scarlet, gold crescent on the banners marking it as the Sultan's residence, and from there Mehmed could observe the entire siege, watching his plans unfold with the detachment of a chess player studying the board. By evening of that first day, the deployment was complete, and the scale became clear to every defender who looked out from the walls. 60 to 80,000 Ottoman soldiers surrounded Belgrade in an organized ring, with artillery positions marked by earth embankments and infantry camps identified by their regimental colors, and cavalry picketed in sections where they could respond quickly to any threat. Inside the walls, maybe 30,000 total people, but most of them peasants with farm tools who'd never seen combat, with perhaps 7,000 actual soldiers who had any real training or experience, and the mathematics of that disparity was obvious to anyone who could count. Hunyadi stood on the citadel walls with Silagi, watching the Ottoman preparations in silence heavy with meaning, and decades of military experience told him exactly what was coming with perfect clarity. Systematic bombardment, followed by breach, followed by assault, the same pattern that had worked at Constantinople and dozens of other fortresses. Silagi finally spoke, breaking the silence, asking the question that was on everyone's mind. "Can we hold?" Hunyadi didn't answer with words immediately, just pointed silently at the Ottoman artillery positions with their rows of massive guns, then pointed at Belgrade's old-fashioned walls built in an era before artillery made stone fortifications obsolete, and the gesture said everything words couldn't. Those guns would reduce the fortifications to rubble over time, systematically destroying defenses that had no chance of withstanding modern siege warfare. Whether they could hold depended entirely on what happened after the walls fell, on whether the defenders could contest the breaches and hold the rubble, and prevent the Ottomans from establishing footholds inside the fortress. Beside them on the stone battlements, Giovanni de Capistrano knelt with his ornate crucifix raised toward the Ottoman host, praying in Latin while tears streamed down his weathered face, asking God to deliver his faithful followers from this vast army of infidels. 48 hours later, the world would end in fire and thunder and blood. July 5th, 1456, day 2 of the siege. The first cannon fired at dawn, and the sound wasn't just loud in any ordinary sense. It was physical, a compression of air that hit your chest like an invisible fist and forced breath from your lungs whether you wanted to exhale or not. Men standing on the walls flinched involuntarily, bodies reacting before minds could process what was happening, and birds exploded from trees a mile away in panicked clouds, thousands of them taking flight simultaneously as if the world itself was ending. Horses in the city screamed and pulled at their tethers with wild eyes, that primal animal fear that knows danger even when it can't understand the source. And some broke free and ran through the streets in blind terror until they collapsed from exhaustion or crashed into walls. The stone ball, roughly 2 feet in diameter and weighing somewhere around 300 pounds of solid rock, arced through the morning sky with a sound like cloth being ripped, a tearing noise that grew louder as it approached, and it slammed into the lower town's wooden palisade and obliterated 20 feet of wall in an explosion of splinters and dust. The impact crater was 6 feet deep, the palisade simply ceasing to exist where the ball struck. Wooden beams that had taken weeks to set in place reduced to kindling in a fraction of a second. Then the second gun fired from a different position, then the third, and within an hour every Ottoman cannon was roaring in a coordinated bombardment that would continue without meaningful pause for the next 17 days. A mechanical symphony of destruction that would break stone and men with equal efficiency. The pattern was deliberate, calculated by engineers who understood both metallurgy and human psychology, designed to break both fortifications and the minds of defenders. Ottoman gunners worked in 3 shifts, rotating every 8 hours, so the bombardment never stopped, never paused long enough for defenders to truly rest or repair damage properly, creating a constant state of crisis that ground down morale as effectively as it ground down walls. When a gun overheated, and the massive bombards did this regularly because the metal expanded from repeated firing until cracks appeared in the barrel, it was hauled back by ox teams, and another gun was dragged forward to replace it, maintaining the steady rhythm of destruction. The Ottomans had brought spare guns for exactly this reason, understanding that artillery was as much about maintaining psychological pressure as it was about physical destruction. Day and night the bombardment continued. Boom, wait while the crew reloaded. Crash as the ball struck stone or earth. Boom again, an endless cycle that became the heartbeat of the siege, drilling into your skull until you couldn't remember what silence sounded like, until the absence of bombardment felt more disturbing than its presence. The rhythm became so constant that defenders couldn't sleep for more than an hour at a time before another impact jolted them awake, hearts racing, wondering if this was the shot that would finally bring the walls down on top of them. They couldn't think straight because the constant noise disrupted cognition, made planning difficult, turned simple conversations into shouting matches. Men had to yell to communicate even when standing 3 feet apart, faces inches from each other, and still words got lost in the ringing that never left anyone's ears. The permanent tinnitus became a high-pitched whine that followed survivors for the rest of their lives, a souvenir of Belgrade that would never fade. And the walls started to die, slowly but inexorably, the way a tree dies from repeated axe strikes. The lower town went first because it was the most vulnerable, the easiest target. The wooden palisades that Szilágyi had carefully reinforced were designed to stop arrows and mounted cavalry and infantry charges, traditional medieval threats, but they were never intended to withstand industrial artillery, and the first day's bombardment reduced entire sections to kindling and splinters scattered across the ground. By day 3, gaps opened wide enough to march a company of soldiers through without any impediment, and by day 5, the lower town's defenses existed only in scattered fragments, broken teeth in a mouth that had been systematically smashed. But Hunyadi had expected this outcome, had planned for it, because he understood that the lower town was ultimately expendable. A buffer zone that would buy time but couldn't be held forever against this level of firepower. The real fortress was the stone citadel on the bluff. That was where they'd make their stand. And that's where Mehmed concentrated his fire once the lower town's defenses were obviously broken. Stone walls that had stood for 200 years, that had weathered storms and minor sieges, and the simple erosion of time, began to crack under the relentless pounding like pottery subjected to too much heat. Ottoman engineers understood the physics of destruction perfectly. You don't spread your fire across the entire wall trying to damage everything at once. You focus on specific points and hit the same section of wall over and over, methodically pulverizing the masonry until the binding mortar turns to dust and the stones have nothing holding them together, and they simply tumble down. They mark their target points with colored flags visible from the gun positions, bright fabric that stood out against the stone and smoke, and gunners adjusted their aim after each shot, watching where balls struck and making tiny corrections, walking their fire onto the target with professional precision. When they found the range perfectly, when balls were consistently striking within a few feet of each other, they locked in that position and hammered that spot for hours without stopping, each impact weakening the structure more until the inevitable collapse came. Towers crumbled, defensive structures that had stood for generations reduced to rubble in days. Merlins, the protective stone teeth on top of the walls that gave defenders cover, shattered under direct hits, exposing anyone who stood there to arrow fire from below. Dust hung in the air so thick you could taste stone powder in every breath, coating your tongue and throat, choking you, making you cough up gray phlegm that spoke of lungs slowly being destroyed by the constant inhalation of pulverized rock. The noise inside the citadel was genuinely apocalyptic. Not just the cannon fire from outside, but the sound of your own fortress dying around you. The groan of stressed stone as structural integrity failed. The crack of failing masonry that sounded like bones breaking. The crash of collapsing sections echoing through the streets and courtyards. Each sound a reminder that the walls protecting you were slowly ceasing to exist. The defenders did what they could with the resources available, working frantically during the brief periods after dark when Ottoman gunners slowed their fire slightly, not stopping, but reducing their rate to conserve powder and preserve their night vision for defensive purposes. Work crews scrambled to repair damage, packing rubble into gaps in the walls using broken stones and timber, scavenged from damaged buildings to create crude patches that wouldn't stop sustained bombardment, but might slow it down temporarily. They shored up weakened sections with wooden beams, creating internal supports that might prevent total collapse, buying precious hours or days. Behind the worst breaches, they built secondary walls, hasty constructions of rubble and earth piled up that wouldn't stop a determined assault, but might provide some cover for defenders during the fighting that everyone knew was coming. It was exhausting, desperate labor done under constant threat because Ottoman sharpshooters watched the walls carefully at night, and anyone who showed themselves for too long risked an arrow through the throat from an archer they never saw. Small Ottoman raiding parties probed the defenses after dark, testing for weak points and killing sentries, and keeping defenders constantly on edge so they could never truly rest. Hunyadi rotated his men constantly to prevent total collapse from exhaustion, understanding that tired soldiers make mistakes, and mistakes in siege warfare are fatal. A soldier would do 6 hours on the walls watching for attacks, 6 hours on work crews repairing damage, 6 hours of rest, except rest was nearly impossible with the constant bombardment and the fear and the heat. So men got maybe 2 or 3 hours of actual sleep before being roused again. He had maybe a dozen cannons of his own, small guns that were pitiful compared to Ottoman artillery, 4 and 6 pounders that couldn't damage enemy positions, but could kill exposed crews. And these were poorly supplied with gunpowder because Hungary's finances were a disaster, and military supplies were always the first thing cut when money ran short. He ordered his gunners to fire sparingly, to make every shot count, only when they had clean shots at Ottoman artillery crews where success was likely. Every Ottoman gunner they killed bought maybe an hour of reduced fire while a replacement crew was brought up from the reserves, and every hour mattered. Every hour let them repair a little more, and rest a little more and survive a little longer before the inevitable assault came. Capistrano turned the siege into spiritual warfare, transforming a military crisis into a religious crusade happening in real time. Every morning and evening, he held services in the Citadel's chapel, a small stone building near the keep that had survived the bombardment so far through luck or divine protection, depending on your perspective. And the services were packed with crusaders, desperate for reassurance that their faith wasn't misplaced. But Capistrano didn't stay safely inside the chapel where stone walls provided some protection. He led prayers on the actual walls while cannonballs screamed overhead close enough to feel the displaced air, holding his crucifix high while stone fragments rained down around him, voice raw from shouting over the thunder of artillery. To the professional soldiers, men like Hunyadi and Silagi, who understood warfare as mathematics and logistics, it looked like suicide, standing exposed on damaged battlements and making yourself a target for Ottoman sharpshooters, accomplishing nothing tactical and risking the loss of the one person holding the Crusader army together. But to the peasant crusaders who'd never been in combat before and were terrified beyond words, it was proof that their friar was protected by God himself, that he stood in a place of special divine favor. If cannonballs couldn't touch him, If arrows missed him when he stood in plain sight, maybe they couldn't touch anyone fighting for Christ. Maybe faith really was armor more effective than steel. The logic was absolutely insane from a military perspective, but it worked in practice. Faith became a weapon that Hunyadi hadn't counted on and didn't fully understand, but learned to value. Men who should have broken under the bombardment, who had every rational reason to desert and flee and hide in the deepest cellars and pray the Ottomans would show mercy to those who didn't resist, kept showing up for wall duty, kept hauling stones for repairs, kept standing watch through the endless nights, and morale, inexplicably and against all military logic, held despite the impossible circumstances. By July 14th, day 11 of the siege, the walls were dying faster than defenders could possibly repair them. The mathematics of destruction finally overwhelming human effort. The lower town's defenses were completely gone, erased so thoroughly you could barely tell where they'd stood, and the area was now occupied by Ottoman forward positions with Turkish archers and arquebusiers firing from the ruins at anyone who showed themselves on the citadel walls. The earthwork bastions that had protected the lower town's approaches were flattened, reduced to scorched earth mixed with splinters and ash, creating clear fields of fire that favored attackers. The moat encircling the citadel was half filled with rubble from collapsed wall sections, creating rough causeways across what should have been an impassable water barrier, and bodies floated in the water that remained, decomposing in the summer heat. The citadel's outer wall had breaches ranging from 10 to 30 feet wide, where Ottoman guns had hammered the same spots for over a week, each breach representing hundreds of cannon shots and thousands of pounds of gunpowder burned to break stone, and the largest breach was where a defensive tower had stood, now just a gap filled with tumbled stones, sloping down into the moat like a ramp. Defenders could see Ottoman infantry massing in the forward trenches during daylight, siege ladders being assembled by carpenters in areas protected from defensive fire, Janissaries forming up in their distinctive white caps and checking weapons and preparing mentally for the assault everyone knew was coming. That morning, Hunyadi walked the walls inspecting damage personally despite the fever that made every step an act of will. He looked like death warmed over, gaunt and gray with fever-bright eyes that burned in his skull, skin hanging loose on bones where muscle had wasted away, and the illness was visibly consuming him day by day. But he moved with purpose that came from 4 decades of military discipline, checking every defensive position personally because he trusted his own eyes more than anyone's report. At the main breach, the 30-foot gap where the tower had stood, he stopped and stared for a long moment, calculating angles and distances and probabilities. Rubble had tumbled into the moat, creating an easy slope the Ottomans could charge up without needing ladders or special equipment, just running straight up the broken stone and into the citadel's heart. And this would be the killing ground where the siege would be decided, where the most brutal fighting would happen when the assault finally came. He called for his best troops, the ones he trusted most in desperate situations, Hungarian heavy infantry in half-plate armor, professionals who'd trained for years and knew how to hold formation under pressure, and Serbian mercenaries with axes who'd been fighting Turks for years and survived through skill and viciousness. He positioned them at the breach with clear instructions. When the assault comes, and it will come soon, this is where it hits hardest. This is where you hold or we all die, simple as that. Then he did something that surprised everyone watching and marked a shift in his thinking. He asked Capistrano to position crusaders on the intact walls above and behind the breach, ready to support with missile fire and reinforcement if needed, using the untrained peasants in a way that might actually help instead of just getting them killed uselessly. Capistrano's eyes lit up with religious fervor when he heard this because it meant his people would fight after all, would be allowed to strike at the enemies of God instead of just hauling stones and praying in the rear. And he immediately began organizing his crusaders into something resembling military formations, though the organization was loose and based more on enthusiasm than any understanding of tactics. That afternoon, the Ottoman drums changed rhythm, shifting from the steady background boom that accompanied artillery fire to something different, faster and sharper, the cadence of attack that every experienced soldier recognized with sinking dread. From the citadel walls, defenders watched the Ottoman lines shift as infantry rose from trenches where they'd been sheltering from defensive fire, as ladders were lifted by teams of soldiers, as shields were locked into formations designed to protect against arrows and crossbow bolts. All the preliminary movements before an assault that veterans recognized immediately. Then the advance began in earnest. Not a disorganized charge, but a professional military operation executed with the precision of armies that had done this many times before. The first wave hit the lower town's ruins, raiders who dismounted to fight as shock troops, sprinting across open ground toward the shattered defenses with the reckless courage of men promised paradise if they died. Behind them came provincial infantry in successive waves, carrying scaling ladders and grappling hooks and bundles of sticks to fill in remaining moat sections, moving in organized units that maintained formation despite defensive fire. The defenders Hunyadi had positioned in the lower town ruins, militia, and some of Capistrano's crusaders hidden among the rubble where Ottoman artillery couldn't target them effectively, opened fire from concealment. Crossbows snapped with their distinctive mechanical sound, primitive arquebuses cracked with puffs of smoke, and the acrid smell of gunpowder, and men dropped in the advancing Ottoman ranks. But there were too many attackers coming in too many waves for the small defending force to stop them all. Within an hour, Ottomans swarmed over what remained of the palisades and poured into the lower town, and street fighting erupted immediately, vicious and intimate killing in narrow lanes choked with rubble and ash, where there was no room for formation fighting or cavalry charges. No room for anything except individual combat and small group melees where strength and desperation mattered more than training. Hungarian soldiers with axes faced Ottoman infantry, with scimitars and shields in brutal exchanges, where both sides took casualties. Serbian defenders with war hammers fought like demons possessed, knowing they were battling the empire that had enslaved their homeland and destroyed their families, fighting with a fury born of personal hatred that made them terrifying opponents. Capistrano's crusaders, untrained but zealous, threw themselves into combat with crosses stitched to their chests, swinging scythes and clubs that were never designed as weapons, screaming prayers that sounded more like battle cries, and sometimes their desperate attacks worked through sheer unexpected ferocity. The combat was brutal beyond description, blood turning the dust and ash to black mud that sucked at boots, bodies falling across each other in doorways and alleyways until you had to climb over corpses to advance. And by mid-afternoon, the lower town was definitively lost despite the defenders' fierce resistance. But Hunyadi had planned for exactly this outcome, had never intended to hold the lower town indefinitely because the mathematics made that impossible. And as Ottomans consolidated control of the lower town and began organizing for the next phase, they realized with growing horror that they'd captured a death trap rather than a staging area. The citadel sat on the bluff directly above them, providing a commanding position, and Hunyadi had carefully positioned his best archers and gunners on those walls with clear fields of fire down into the streets below. They opened fire straight down into the packed Ottoman ranks, shooting almost vertically down at enemies who had nowhere to hide and no cover. Arrows and crossbow bolts rained into Ottoman formations from above like deadly hail, and arquebuses cracked from multiple positions, and small cannons loaded with bags of scrap metal, nails and broken chains and pottery shards and anything else that would fragment when fired, turned narrow approaches into killing zones where dozens of men died in seconds. The Ottomans had nowhere to take cover because the ruined buildings provided no overhead protection. Every doorway and every wall fragment could hide a defender with a crossbow, waiting to shoot anyone who came close. And attempting to advance toward the citadel gates meant running a gauntlet of fire from multiple directions simultaneously. They tried pushing toward the citadel gates anyway, because staying in the lower town meant dying slowly from defensive fire, but the approaches were deliberately narrow. Ancient defensive design by architects who understood that forcing attackers into choke points multiplied the effectiveness of defenders. Approaches were flanked by towers that Hunyadi had heavily garrisoned, and defenders in those towers poured fire from multiple angles at once, shooting at enemies from 3 directions simultaneously so there was nowhere safe to stand. The attackers were cut down in heaps, bodies piling 4 and 5 deep in the narrow passages, creating obstacles of corpses that the next wave had to climb over while being shot at from above. The Janissaries, held in reserve until this critical moment, were finally committed to force the gates through sheer professional skill where provincial troops had failed. These were the elite veterans of Constantinople and a dozen other sieges, the best trained infantry in the world, men who'd survived countless battles through discipline and skill, and they moved with professional precision that set them apart from other troops, shields locked together, advancing through the defensive fire methodically without breaking formation even as men fell around them. They got within 50 feet of the gates, close enough that defenders could see individual faces and the determination in their eyes before concentrated arquebus fire from the flanking towers stopped them cold. Even the best infantry in the world can't advance when half the front rank drops in 10 seconds from simultaneous fire. When the professional discipline that usually protects them becomes irrelevant against overlapping fields of fire they can't avoid. They fell back in good order, maintaining formation even in retreat. Regrouped in areas with some cover, tried again with fresh troops, failed again against the same overlapping defensive fire that made the approaches impassable. By nightfall, the Ottomans held the lower town firmly, their banners flying from the ruins in victory, but the citadel remained intact and defiant, its walls still standing despite the day's fighting. The cost had been horrific for both sides, estimates ranging from 500 to over 1,000 Ottoman dead in a single afternoon's fighting, losses that would have broken lesser armies, and defender casualties were lighter because they'd fought from protected positions, but still significant with maybe 200 killed and wounded. Losses they could barely afford given how small their total force was compared to the Ottoman army. Mehmed watched the day's events from his pavilion on the hill, his face unreadable behind his beard, and his generals expected him to pause and consolidate gains and give troops time to recover from the brutal fighting before attempting another assault. Instead, Mehmed gave new orders that surprised even his closest advisors. Bring up the sappers and begin mining operations immediately. That night, while exhausted defenders tried to grab a few hours of sleep before the next crisis, Ottoman engineers began digging with the methodical determination of professionals who'd done this many times before. Not toward the walls in obvious trenches that defenders could see and counter, but under them in tunnels that couldn't be stopped by arrows or cannon fire. They started approach trenches first, zigzagging lines carved into the earth that allowed soldiers to advance while protected from defensive fire, and at the end of these trenches, deep shafts went down into the ground, disappearing into darkness. Mining operations designed to tunnel under the citadel's foundations and packed chambers with gunpowder and blow the walls from below, creating breaches too large and too sudden to defend properly, overwhelming defenders before they could react. It was the same tactic that had worked at Constantinople, that had broken walls which couldn't be breached from outside, and Mehmed was methodically applying the lessons of his greatest victory, proving that he learned from experience and adapted tactics to circumstances. How do you fight an enemy you can't see? One that's underneath you in the dark, coming closer every hour, one that might detonate explosives beneath your feet at any moment. By July 16th, day 13 of the siege, the defenders could hear them clearly through the stone. The scrape of shovels moving earth with steady rhythm, the creak of timber supports being installed in tunnels, the sounds transmitted through the fortress foundations like a heartbeat from below. You'd be standing on the citadel walls during a quiet moment and feel a faint vibration through your feet, subtle but unmistakable, the sensation of men working beneath you in the darkness, and the knowledge that they were placing explosives that could kill you without warning was psychologically devastating. Hunyadi ordered countermines dug immediately, understanding that you couldn't just wait and hope the enemy mining operations failed on their own. Defenders started their own tunnels from inside the citadel, burrowing down into the earth with picks and shovels, listening carefully for the sounds of enemy digging, trying to intercept Ottoman tunnels before they reached the walls. The underground war was nightmare fuel that haunted survivors for the rest of their lives, combat in conditions that violated every human instinct about how fighting should happen. When a countermine broke through into an Ottoman tunnel, and this happened dozens of times over the next few days, fighting erupted in spaces barely wide enough for one man to crawl through, certainly not wide enough to swing a sword properly or even turn around. Total darkness because torches used up the limited air too fast, and you suffocated in minutes if you tried to fight with flames burning. You fought by touch and sound, feeling for your enemy in the blackness, stabbing with daggers because there was no room to swing anything larger, strangling with bare hands when you got close enough, smashing skulls against tunnel walls using rock or fist. Sometimes the tunnels collapsed during the fighting from the structural damage or destabilization caused by combat, and both sides were buried alive in an instant. Tons of earth crushing you before you could scream, and your body would never be recovered. Neither side could retreat easily because the tunnels were too narrow to turn around in, so you fought forward until one side was completely dead or managed to collapse the tunnel on purpose to stop the advance. The defenders collapsed over 50 Ottoman mining attempts this way over the course of days, filling enemy tunnels with rubble or drowning some with water diverted from the river through improvised channels. But the Ottomans kept digging with mechanical persistence. They had hundreds of miners, many of them Christian slaves from the Balkans, forced to do this dangerous work, expendable labor that could be replaced easily if they died in tunnel collapses or were killed by counterminers. And some tunnels inevitably got through the defenses simply because there weren't enough defenders to intercept every single one. July 18th, day 15. At dawn, before most defenders were fully awake, the explosion came without any warning at all. A section of the citadel's outer wall, about 40 feet of masonry that had stood for 2 centuries, lifted into the air in a gout of fire and pulverized stone, disintegrating in an instant. The blast echo rolled across the fortress like thunder, a sound so loud it was felt in your chest more than heard in your ears, and debris rained down hundreds of feet away, chunks of stone the size of men falling from the sky and crashing through roofs. The shockwave shattered windows in buildings 200 yards from the blast, glass exploding inward and cutting anyone standing nearby, and defenders were thrown off their feet even at a distance. When the dust finally cleared enough to see, there was a breach. Not just a crack or a gap, but a massive wound in the fortress defenses, wide open and gaping. Rubble sloped down into the moat on one side, providing an easy approach, and up into the citadel on the other side, giving attackers a clear path inside. And through that breach, moving fast before defenders could recover from the shock, came the Janissaries in force, white caps visible through the dust and smoke, moving with professional speed that came from years of training, composite bows firing as they advanced to suppress defensive fire, arquebuses cracking from the front ranks, swords drawn for the close combat they knew was coming. They hit the breach before most defenders even realized what had happened, before anyone could organize a coherent response. And for one terrible moment that stretched into eternity, it looked like the citadel would fall right then, that the siege would end in the worst possible way. Then János Hunyadi appeared like a ghost from the smoke, 70 years old and dying from fever, but armored despite the illness that should have left him bedridden and useless. Sword in hand despite hands that shook from weakness, leading his household guard in a desperate counterattack that stopped the Janissary advance through sheer determination. The fighting at the breach was absolute hell. Elite soldiers against elite soldiers in brutal close quarters, combat where training and experience mattered, but luck and desperation mattered more. Hunyadi's guards, Hungarian knights who'd fought beside him for decades and knew his commands without words needing to be spoken, crashed into the Janissaries with the fury of men defending their last position. There were no fancy tactics or clever maneuvers, just brutal close quarters, fighting where you tried to kill the man in front of you before he killed you. Steel rang on steel constantly, shields smashed into faces, breaking noses and teeth. Daggers found gaps in armor and punched through into flesh, and bodies piled in the rubble that made footing treacherous. Blood made the broken stones slick as ice, and men lost their footing and were killed before they could rise, stabbed by enemies who showed no mercy to anyone who fell. The Janissaries were driven back slowly, yard by bloody yard, fighting for every foot of ground because retreat meant failure, and Janissaries were trained never to fail. By midday, after hours of continuous combat, the breach was finally retaken, Ottoman banners that had briefly flown from the walls torn down and burned, and the Janissaries retreated to the lower town, leaving hundreds of their dead behind, in piles that would have to be cleared before the next assault. But everyone who survived the fighting knew the brutal truth that no amount of courage could change. The defenders were bleeding out, losing irreplaceable men with every attack and every assault cost. Lives they couldn't replace because there were no reinforcements coming from anywhere. The Ottomans had endless reinforcements, whole provinces they could draw from, replacement units just over the horizon waiting to rotate into the siege. But defenders had only what was inside the walls, and each death brought them closer to the point where there wouldn't be enough men left to hold the line, regardless of courage or faith. Hunyadi knew it with the clarity that comes from decades of military experience. Szilágyi knew it from the casualty reports that kept getting worse. Every professional soldier knew it from simple arithmetic. And across the battlefield in his silk pavilion, Mehmed knew it too, with the patience of a commander who understood that time was his ally. Just keep the pressure on relentlessly, grind them down through attrition, wait for the inevitable mathematical conclusion when defenders were too few to man the walls. But Hunyadi had one desperate gamble left, one move so audacious and insane that no Ottoman commander would see it coming because it violated every rule of defensive siege warfare. He was going to attack, not defend. Attack on the water where Mehmed thought he'd already won. And if it worked, it might break the Ottoman stranglehold long enough for Belgrade to survive. Attack? How could they possibly attack when the citadel was surrounded? When Ottomans outnumbered them 3-1 or worse? When Hunyadi's forces were exhausted and depleted and barely holding the walls against each assault? The answer was the one place Mehmed thought he'd already secured beyond any doubt: the river itself. The Danube wasn't just scenery or a water source. It was a weapon if you understood how to use it. And Mehmed had brought 200 river galleys and transport ships north in a massive fleet assembled over months at great expense. The Ottoman strategy was textbook military doctrine for river sieges. Blockade the fortress from the water, cut all resupply routes, starve the defenders into surrender because fortresses can't hold indefinitely without food and ammunition. Ottoman ships anchored in a defensive line just below where the Sava met the Danube, close enough to bombard the fortress from the river with ship-mounted guns and stop any boats trying to reach Belgrade with supplies or reinforcements. Shore batteries supported the fleet, small cannons positioned on the banks to catch any vessel trying to run the blockade in crossfire between ship guns and shore artillery, creating an overlapping field of fire that seemed impossible to survive. It was solid strategy that had worked in previous sieges across the Ottoman Empire, and it should have been unbreakable. But Mehmed made one critical miscalculation that would cost him dearly. He assumed the defenders would stay defensive, would hide behind their walls and wait for relief that wasn't coming, would never be crazy enough to take their small fleet against his overwhelming naval superiority. Hunyadi had been planning the river attack since before the siege even began, quietly assembling resources while everyone focused on the land approaches. He'd commandeered riverboats from fishermen all along the Danube, while Mehmed was still marching north, offering payment when he could, or simply taking vessels in the name of Hungary's defense when money wasn't available, understanding that desperate times required desperate measures. Merchant vessels that normally carried grain or timber were hastily armed with whatever light guns he could spare from the fortress. 4- and 6-pounders lashed to reinforced decks that weren't designed to handle recoil, and where he couldn't find enough boats, he had carpenters lashed together rafts from timber, reinforced with additional beams to carry men and light artillery. Maybe 50 vessels total in his improvised fleet, mismatched and undergunned and vastly outnumbered by the Ottoman fleet's 200 warships, and by any rational military calculation, taking this fleet against Ottoman galleys was suicide. But Hunyadi's boats had advantages that Ottoman galleys didn't possess, advantages that might matter if used correctly. They were crewed by men who'd spent their entire lives on the Danube and knew every current intimately, every sandbar that appeared in summer when water levels dropped, every trick the river could play on those who didn't respect it. They were smaller and more maneuverable in the twisting currents where the two rivers met, able to turn quickly where heavy galleys would struggle. And most importantly, Hunyadi was willing to do what Ottoman commanders wouldn't expect from a defender: go on the offensive when he should be cowering behind walls and hoping for mercy. July 14th, the same day Ottomans assaulted the lower town, and Janissaries tried to force the citadel gates, while fighting raged in the streets below, while everyone's attention was focused on the land battle. Hunyadi took his fleet downriver in a move so audacious it should probably be taught in military academies. He left command of the fortress to Szilágy with explicit instructions, boarded the lead boat, which was a reinforced fishing vessel with a light cannon mounted at the bow, and despite the fever racking his body that made every movement difficult, despite advisors begging him to stay in the fortress and rest because he might die from exertion, he insisted on commanding personally because his presence mattered more than his health. The rivermen needed to see him, needed to believe this suicide mission could somehow work. They rowed downstream using the current to build speed, letting the Danube itself do much of the work. And the river was running fast in midsummer, swollen with snowmelt from the Alps hundreds of miles away. And that current was an ally that could turn small boats into fast-moving weapons if you knew how to read the water. The Ottoman fleet saw them coming from a distance because 50 boats moving downstream creates a visible disturbance on the water. But Ottoman commanders didn't react immediately with alarm because what they saw looked like desperation rather than tactics. 50 boats against 200 seemed like suicide, like defenders making a final gesture before inevitable defeat. Then Hunyadi's lead boats opened fire, and the first cannon shots were both signal to his own fleet and shock to the Ottoman navy. Light guns cracked from the Christian boats, 4- and 6-pounders that couldn't sink heavy galleys, but could absolutely kill crews on open decks, sending iron balls screaming across the water at velocities that turned men into broken meat. Arrows and crossbow bolts arced across the water in clouds thick enough to darken the sky briefly, and Ottoman sailors scrambled for weapons, shouting contradictory orders because nobody had expected this. Nobody had planned for defenders to attack their vastly superior fleet. The Christian boats closed fast, using currents and coordinated rowing to build momentum that gave them ram-like force, and then Hunyadi deployed what he'd been saving for exactly this moment: fire ships, the ancient naval weapon that still worked because fire doesn't care about armor or training. 3 boats packed with everything that burns, packed in so tight there was barely room to move. Pitch barrels had been cracked open, and their contents spread across the decks in thick layers. Straw bales soaked in oil until they could barely burn wetter. Timber from demolished buildings inside the fortress. Animal fat from the fortress stores that burned hot and long. The boats were floating bonfires waiting to be lit, mobile bombs that would transform water into an inferno. Skeleton crews, volunteers who understood this was likely a suicide mission, but volunteered anyway because some men are that brave, sailed the fire ships into position with steady hands despite the terror they must have felt. When they were about 100 yards from the Ottoman fleet's anchored line, close enough that the ships wouldn't drift off course, they set the fires using torches and oil-soaked rags. The flames caught instantly with a whoosh of igniting vapors, oil-soaked straw erupting into towering flames, pitch burning with thick black smoke that could be seen for miles, and within seconds the fire ships were infernos, floating hells moving steadily toward the Ottoman fleet on the current. The skeleton crews jumped overboard into the cold Danube and swam desperately for pickup boats following behind, and not all of them made it to safety. Ottoman archers on the galleys, realizing what was happening, shot at men struggling in the water who made easy targets, and some drowned when their clothes got waterlogged and dragged them under before they could be pulled aboard Christian boats. But most were rescued, pulled aboard the rescue vessels and immediately given oars. Because there was no time to rest, the battle was just beginning and every hand was needed. The burning ships drifted straight into the Ottoman fleet on the current that gave them momentum even without crews, and panic erupted on the water like a contagion spreading through the fleet. Ottoman galleys were anchored close together for mutual support and coordinated defense, which was standard fleet tactics and usually smart, but that meant no room to maneuver when fireships appeared. When captains saw the floating infernos bearing down on their vessels, they screamed for crews to cut anchor lines immediately, to row backward away from the flames, to do anything to avoid collision with fire. Ships collided with each other, trying to evade in the chaos. Oars tangled between vessels and snapped. Crews shouted at neighboring ships that were backing into them, and the formation that had seemed so solid minutes before disintegrated into chaos. When the first fire ship hit an Ottoman galley, with a grinding crash of wood on wood, flames spread like plague through the fleet because wooden ships soaked in tar burned magnificently. Pitch stuck to wood and didn't wash off no matter how much water you threw on it, burning through any attempt to extinguish it. Rigging made of hemp rope that had been tarred to preserve it ignited in seconds once flames touched it. Sails caught fire and became torches hanging above the decks. Within minutes, multiple Ottoman ships were burning out of control, crews abandoning them by jumping overboard into water that suddenly seemed full of drowning men. But the Danube in midsummer wasn't the warm Mediterranean that Ottoman sailors were accustomed to. The water was cold from mountain snowmelt, cold enough to be dangerous, and the current was stronger than many expected. Men in armor drowned almost immediately, pulled under by the weight of steel before they could even shout for help. Men without armor got swept downstream by current that was stronger than they could swim against, and hypothermia took some of them as cold water leached the heat from their bodies. The river didn't care which side you fought for, didn't distinguish between Christian and Muslim, just killed anyone who entered it unprepared with cold efficiency. Through the smoke and confusion that made visibility nearly impossible, Hunyadi's boats closed in for hand-to-hand combat like wolves attacking a wounded deer. The fighting on the water was brutal chaos that bore no resemblance to organized naval combat. Christian crews pulled alongside Ottoman galleys and boarded them, climbing over rails while fighting off defenders. And there were no formations or tactics possible on rocking decks. Just scrambling over rails with weapons drawn and fighting whoever you encountered first. Hand-to-hand combat on slippery decks that tilted unpredictably while ships burned around you and water churned below. Hunyadi's rivermen fought with the fury of men who'd lost everything to Ottoman raids over the years. Men who'd watched their villages burn and their families taken as slaves and now finally had a chance to strike back. Serbian refugees who'd fled when their homeland was conquered, who'd spent years living as unwanted outsiders, now set Turkish ships ablaze and felt something like justice, something like revenge for everything they'd lost. Hungarian soldiers who knew this was their last chance to hurt the enemy before the fortress fell made every swing count, fighting with desperate efficiency because there would be no second chances. They used axes and boarding pikes, weapons specifically designed for fighting on boats, where swinging a sword was difficult because of limited space and unsteady footing. They grappled and stabbed and pushed men overboard into water that killed as effectively as any blade. They set fires on captured ships rather than trying to sail them away, because turning every victory into another weapon against the fleet was more valuable than capturing prizes. And within hours, the Ottoman fleet was burning from multiple points. Ottoman Marines, professional infantry positioned on the ships for exactly this kind of combat, fought back hard because they were too well trained to panic. These weren't just sailors, they were soldiers who'd fought naval battles in the Aegean and Black Seas, veterans who knew their business, professional killers with scimitars and shields who understood close-quarters combat. But they weren't fighting in the open water they'd trained for. They were fighting in a river at a confluence where the water did unpredictable things. Ships spun in eddies created by conflicting currents. Boats drifted into each other unexpectedly. And the Ottoman advantage in training and equipment meant less when you were fighting to keep your balance on a deck tilting under your feet at random angles. The battle raged for hours, smoke from burning ships visible for miles, and by mid-afternoon the Ottoman fleet was shattered beyond recognition. At least a dozen galleys captured, though most were too damaged to be useful for anything except scrap wood and were deliberately scuttled to deny them to any enemy. 20 or more burning or already sunk, only masts visible above the waterline, marking where proud warships had gone down. The survivors, maybe 100 ships that had managed to escape the chaos, cut their anchor lines and fled downstream, oars thrashing the water in panicked retreat, abandoning the blockade entirely. Hunyadi stood on the deck of a captured galley that was still mostly intact, sword still in hand dripping blood, watching the Ottoman fleet flee with grim satisfaction. He'd broken Mehmed's river blockade, achieved something that should have been impossible, and Belgrade could now be resupplied from the water. The stranglehold was lifted. The fortress could hold out indefinitely if they could just survive the land assaults. And it was an impossible victory that proved faith and desperation could sometimes overcome superior numbers, but it nearly killed him, cost him almost everything he had left. Hunyadi collapsed on the return voyage, the adrenaline that had kept him upright through hours of combat finally draining away completely, and the fever came roaring back with vengeance. He went down on the deck like a puppet with cut strings, falling so suddenly that men nearby barely caught him before his head hit the planks. His officers checked for a pulse and couldn't find one they could feel clearly, and his skin was gray and cold despite the summer heat, looking more corpse than living man. They carried him off the boat when they docked in Belgrade, handling him as gently as possible because they thought he was dying right then. Capistrano was summoned urgently to give last rites, and he administered the sacraments while weeping openly because even the fanatical friar recognized that Hunyadi had saved them all. Scythes prepared mentally to take full command of the defense, expecting Hunyadi to die within hours, making plans for how to maintain morale when their greatest commander was gone. For 2 days, Hunyadi burned with fever so intense his skin felt hot to touch, unconscious and unresponsive, barely breathing. When he surfaced briefly into something approaching consciousness, he was delirious, raving in multiple languages, Hungarian and Latin and Serbian, and even Turkish picked up from decades of fighting and negotiating with them. He called out for men who died at Varna 12 years earlier, gave orders for battles long finished, relived traumas that had never fully healed. On the third day, when everyone had given up hope, he opened his eyes, looked directly at Scythes, and asked for a situation report in a clear voice that shocked everyone present. The old bastard wasn't done yet, refused to die while Budapest needed him, but everyone who saw him knew the brutal truth. He'd bought them time by spending his own life, and the cost of the river victory was killing him by inches. Across the battlefield in his silk pavilion overlooking the siege, Mehmed II was not handling defeat well, and Ottoman sources tell us less about this because showing the Sultan in weakness wasn't politically wise. His fleet, the weapon meant to starve Belgrade into submission through blockade, had been destroyed by fishing boats and improvised rafts crewed by peasants. His carefully planned blockade had been broken by rivermen who shouldn't have been able to challenge his navy. His reputation as the brilliant conqueror of Constantinople, the Sultan who'd achieved what generations before him couldn't, was being damaged by an old man who should have been in bed dying instead of winning impossible victories. Ottoman sources written later, after passions cooled, claimed the Sultan calmly reassessed strategy and made tactical adjustments with the wisdom of an experienced commander. Christian sources written by people who had no reason to make him look good paint a much different picture. Mehmed in absolute rage, threatening to execute the fleet admiral publicly before being talked down by advisors who pointed out that executing competent officers during a difficult siege would destroy morale. The admiral was still stripped of rank immediately and sent back to Constantinople in disgrace, his career destroyed, a warning to other commanders that failure would not be tolerated regardless of circumstances. What we know with certainty is Mehmed's decision after the naval defeat. No more gradual pressure, no more waiting for starvation or mining operations or methodical siegecraft to slowly break the defenders. He wanted Belgrade taken by force immediately, within days, regardless of cost in lives or resources. He ordered an all-out assault on the citadel, using every available soldier, every remaining gun firing simultaneously, everything he had left thrown at those walls in one overwhelming wave. The message to his commanders was absolutely clear. Take the fortress in the next assault or die trying, and failure would be punished severely because the Sultan's patience was exhausted. The defenders had maybe 72 hours to prepare for what was coming, 3 days to ready themselves for the apocalypse they all knew was approaching. Hunyadi, still weak from the fever that had nearly killed him, directed repairs and preparations from a chair because standing for long periods left him dizzy and weak, but his mind remained sharp. The breach from the mine explosion, that gaping wound in the fortress wall, was shored up as well as possible with timber frames filled with rubble, creating a rough barrier that wouldn't stop sustained assault, but might slow it enough for defenders to react and counterattack. New barricades went up behind weak points throughout the citadel, rubble walls cobbled together from broken stones and timber, hasty constructions that wouldn't survive artillery but might provide cover during infantry assault. Every resource was redistributed according to priority, with experienced quartermasters making life-and-death decisions about allocation. Gunpowder was pulled from less critical positions and rationed to the guns with the best fields of fire, the ones that could do the most damage to massed attackers. Arrows were counted carefully because they were running dangerously low after days of combat, and every shaft would have to count. No wasted shots. Arquebuses were cleaned meticulously, checked for cracks or defects that could cause them to explode, loaded carefully with measured charges. Axes and war hammers were sharpened on whetstones until edges could split hairs. Water barrels were positioned at every defensive position because fire was a constant threat during assaults, and men fighting in July heat would collapse from dehydration if they couldn't drink. Capistrano held services around the clock without rest, leading prayers in shifts because his crusaders needed constant spiritual reinforcement. His crusaders prayed when they weren't working, an endless rotation of devotion, and when they weren't working or praying, they were on their knees asking God for deliverance. The citadel never stopped echoing with hymns and prayers, the sound becoming as constant as the artillery had been. And to outsiders, this might have sounded like madness or desperation, but to the defenders, it was armor against fear, something tangible to hold on to when everything else seemed to be falling apart. Silagi walked the walls after dark every night, checking sentries personally, making sure no one fell asleep on watch because exhausted men could fall asleep standing upright, could close their eyes for just a second and not wake up for hours. He carried a bucket of cold water from the river and splashed anyone whose eyes started to close, sometimes gently, sometimes not, depending on how tired they looked. Everyone knew what was coming with absolute certainty now. Mehmed had committed his prestige to this siege, had made it personal, and he couldn't withdraw without looking weak to his own people and his enemies. Weakness for a sultan meant rebellion and assassination and the end of everything he'd built, which meant the next assault would be total. Everything Mehmed had thrown at the walls in one overwhelming wave, designed to break through purely through mass. If the Ottomans broke through this time, if they established footholds inside the citadel and brought enough troops through the breaches, there weren't enough defenders left to stop them. No reserves waiting in the rear, no fallback positions prepared, no reinforcements riding to the rescue, just the final line and the men standing on it. And if they broke, Budapest would fall, and Hungary would be next, and the road to Vienna would lie open. July 21st arrived like a date with destiny. Day 18 of the siege that felt like it had lasted years. At dawn, the Ottoman bombardment intensified beyond anything the defenders had experienced during the previous 17 days, and men who thought they'd seen the worst artillery could do were proven wrong. Every gun Mehmed possessed opened fire simultaneously. Not the usual rotation where some guns fired, while others cooled and reloaded, but everything at once in a coordinated barrage designed to pulverize whatever remained of the walls. The noise was genuinely apocalyptic, beyond anything human ears were designed to handle. Not individual shots that you could distinguish, but a continuous roar, like sustained thunder, like the earth itself was screaming in agony, like God was tearing the world apart. The walls disappeared into clouds of dust and pulverized stones so thick that visibility dropped to nothing. Defenders couldn't see 10 feet in front of their faces, and the air became literally unbreathable. Stone dust so thick that men tied cloth over their faces like bandits and still choked on every breath. Coughed up gray phlegm that spoke of lungs being destroyed. Felt their throats burning from the constant inhalation of pulverized rock. This went on for 6 hours without any pause. 6 hours of continuous bombardment that should have been impossible to sustain, but Mehmed had rotated crews and stockpiled powder specifically for this final push. Then suddenly, shockingly, the guns stopped, and the silence was physically disorienting after nearly 3 weeks of constant noise. After 18 days of bombardment that never fully stopped, the absence of noise felt wrong, unnatural, like the world had ended and nobody had noticed. Ears still rang with permanent damage that would never heal. Men looked at each other in confusion, wondering if they'd gone deaf, and through the clearing, dust-like figures emerging from fog. The defenders saw them coming. The Janissaries, all of them at once, not held in reserve this time, but committed in a single massive formation. Thousands of white-capped elite infantry in organized ranks that stretched as far as eyes could see, through the dust, provincial troops on the flanks providing support. Every soldier Mehmed could commit being thrown at the wall simultaneously, moving in near silence except for the sound of thousands of feet hitting ground in unison, the clink of weapons and armor, disciplined and professional and unstoppable looking. This was the moment when everything would be decided, the final throw of the dice where they'd win or lose in the next few hours. Hunyadi stood on the walls despite the fever that made his vision blur, sword drawn in a hand that trembled, Silagi beside him, looking grim, professional soldiers at their posts knowing this was probably where they'd die. And below in the courtyard, Giovanni da Capistrano knelt with his crucifix surrounded by 25,000 crusaders who believed absolutely that God would save them or take them straight to paradise, which amounted to the same thing in their minds. The Janissaries hit the breaches with professional speed and discipline that set them apart from every other military force in the world. They didn't charge screaming wildly, didn't waste energy on battle cries or bravado. They advanced in formation that maintained cohesion even under fire. Shields locked in the front rank, creating a moving wall. Arquebusiers in the second rank, firing coordinated volleys that suppressed defensive fire. Swordsmen following behind to exploit any gap that opened in the defensive line. Professional, methodical, absolutely terrifying in their discipline and certainty. Hunyadi's troops at the breaches fired back with everything they had. Arquebuses cracked in ragged volleys, crossbows snapped with mechanical precision. Men dropped on both sides as projectiles found targets. But for every Janissary that fell, another stepped over the body without breaking stride and kept coming. And that endless supply of replacements was psychologically devastating. They swarmed up the rubble-filled breaches, using the broken stones as improvised steps. Where walls still stood partially intact, they threw up scaling ladders with 3 men holding the base and 2 climbing with shields on their backs to deflect arrows. Where there were no ladders, elite soldiers climbed barehanded, finding holes in cracked masonry that shouldn't exist, pulling themselves up through skill and strength. The first wave hit the defenders, holding the breach line, and the real killing started immediately, brutal and intimate, steel on steel creating sounds that defenders would hear in nightmares for years if they survived. Pole axes against scimitars, war hammers smashing shields, the fighting so compressed in the narrow breaches that you couldn't swing properly, just stab and shove and use your weight to push opponents off balance on the unstable rubble that shifted under every step. The defenders held barely, hanging on by pure determination. Hunyadi's household guard anchored the main breach, Hungarian knights in half-plate armor, fighting shoulder to shoulder like a living wall, refusing to give a single yard of ground. These were men who'd fought beside Hunyadi for 20 years, who'd survived Varna and dozens of other battles, who knew their business better than almost anyone alive. Serbian mercenaries held the flanks, killing with the cold fury of men defending the last free piece of their conquered homeland, men who gave no quarter because they expected none, because they knew what Ottoman rule meant from personal experience. But the pressure was absolutely relentless. More Janissaries kept coming in waves that seemed endless, fresh troops cycling in to replace the wounded and dead, while the defenders had no reserves. Every man was already committed to the fight. When someone fell, there was no replacement, just a gap in the line that others had to stretch dangerously thin to cover, and gaps started opening everywhere as casualties mounted. An Ottoman banner went up on the battlements. The standard bearer, who was a Janissary officer, planted it on a section of wall the Ottomans had just taken after brutal fighting. The crescent moon and stars snapping in the wind above stones, Christian defenders had held for 18 days of hell. Then another banner rose 50 yards away, then a third at another position. The Janissaries had breached the walls in multiple places simultaneously, were inside the citadel establishing footholds, more troops pouring through behind them to widen the breaches and secure positions. Hunyadi saw it happening from his command position and knew exactly what it meant. Minutes, maybe less, before the defensive line collapsed entirely and couldn't be restored. Once the Janissaries had secured positions inside the walls, they'd widen the breaches and bring in massive numbers of troops, overwhelm the defenders through sheer mass of bodies. Constantinople had fallen exactly this way, breaches leading to footholds leading to collapse, and he was watching the same pattern unfold. He rallied his remaining household guard for a desperate counterattack at the main breach, knowing this might be their last chance. If they could push the Ottomans back there and seal that penetration, maybe they could hold long enough to what? There was no relief force coming, but maybe they could survive one more day. Then he heard something that made him turn, something that shouldn't have been possible, a sound that rose from the citadel courtyard and didn't seem human. 25,000 voices screaming at once. Not a battle cry or a war shout, but something primal and religious and beyond rational thought. A sound that came from the soul rather than the throat. Giovanni da Capistrano had seized his crucifix banner, that symbol he'd carried across Europe gathering his army of faith, and was running toward the breaches. This 70-year-old skeletal friar was sprinting like a man possessed, screaming in Latin for his crusaders to follow, and they followed without hesitation or thought. Not in formation because they didn't know how to form up properly, not with any tactical plan because they'd never been taught tactics. Just a mob, a human flood, an unstoppable wave of faith made flesh. Peasants with scythes still stained from last year's harvest. Old men with rusted swords their fathers had carried in forgotten wars. Criminals with clubs. Serbian refugees with axes. All of them running and screaming prayers, absolutely convinced that God was charging with them, that they were invincible because they fought for Christ. Hunyadi later wrote in his report that he tried to stop them, actually attempted to halt the charge because it was obvious suicide. Untrained rabble throwing themselves at the best infantry in the world would be a massacre that accomplished nothing except depleting their last reserves uselessly. But Capistrano was beyond anyone's control at this point, beyond orders or common sense or any earthly authority, and his crusaders wouldn't have stopped if the Pope himself had ordered it. They believed this was the moment, the prophesied battle where faith would defeat steel, heaven or death with nothing in between, and both equally acceptable. They hit the Janissaries at the breaches like a breaking wave hitting a cliff, and what happened next should have been a slaughter according to every military text ever written. The Janissaries were elite soldiers, taken as boys from Christian families and converted and trained since childhood, in barracks where every single day was combat drill, where weakness meant death and excellence was the only acceptable standard. They were veterans of Constantinople, of campaigns across 3 continents, disciplined beyond anything Western armies could match. Armored and professional killers who'd been doing this their entire lives. The Crusaders were absolutely none of those things. Most had never been in a fight more serious than a tavern brawl. Many had never even seen combat before this moment. They wore whatever they had been working in when they joined Capistrano months ago. They carried tools rather than weapons designed for killing. By every measure of military science, by every rule of warfare established over thousands of years, they should have been annihilated in minutes, cut down like wheat before a scythe. But there were so many of them, more than anyone had calculated or planned for, and they kept coming in waves that seemed endless. They swarmed the breaches like ants overwhelming a larger insect, like floodwater that can't be stopped by barriers or strength, like something elemental that existed beyond military calculations. When the first ranks were cut down, and they were absolutely slaughtered by Janissary swords and axes, more kept coming immediately behind them, and more behind those, and more behind those in waves that never stopped. The Janissaries found themselves overwhelmed not by skill or training or superior tactics, but by pure mass, by numbers that made their advantages irrelevant. A Janissary would kill 2 crusaders with professional efficiency, then a third, then a fourth, working his way through opponents who barely knew how to hold their weapons, and then be tackled by 5 more crusaders who grabbed his arms and legs and pulled him down through sheer weight of bodies. And once down, he'd be beaten to death by men using rocks and fists because their improvised weapons had broken. Crusaders wrestled weapons from Janissary hands in desperate grapples, beat armored soldiers with rocks and clubs when their farm tools shattered, and when one crusader died, 3 more filled the space immediately, stepping over the body without even looking down, pressing forward with absolute conviction that death meant instant paradise. It wasn't warfare in any recognizable sense. It was drowning in bodies. being overwhelmed by human mass that couldn't be stopped with swords or discipline or training. Janissaries, elite troops who'd broken the supposedly impregnable walls of Constantinople just 3 years earlier, found themselves being pulled off the battlements by peasants who didn't know the first thing about combat, but believed with absolute certainty that they were invincible because God protected them. The Ottoman soldiers began giving ground slowly, not routing yet, not fleeing in panic, but backing up step by step.